Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. My guest today is Tim Flannery. Tim Flannery is a monologist and paleontologist. He was the chief commissioner of the Australian Climate Commission and chairman of the Copenhagen Climate Council. He was named Australian Humanist of the Year in 2005 and Australian of the Year in 2007. And he's currently a fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. In this episode, we talk about the Glasgow Climate Change Conference and where the world is at with respect to our carbon reduction goals. We talk about the trade-off between industrialization in developing nations and reducing carbon emissions. We talk about whether we're in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. We discuss whether climate change is making natural disasters worse. We discuss the efficacy of lifestyle changes like becoming a vegetarian, and much more. So without further ado, Tim Flannery. Okay, Tim Flannery, thank you so much for coming on my show.
It's a pleasure, Coleman.
So before we get into The Climate Cure, which is your latest book, and the general topic of climate change and the environment, can you give my listeners a little sense of who you are, how you came to care about this issue?
Sure. Look, Coleman, I'm a scientist. I started off as a paleontologist. I spent, the best part of my career in the Pacific Islands, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and West Papua, Eastern Indonesia. And through that area, I started to see concerning trends. I noticed that the high mountains I was working on, the tree line was rising all over the region. And so I eventually realised this was evidence for climate change. And about 1999, I decided I had to do something about it. All of the biodiversity I was studying was just not going to last if climate change kept on accelerating. So about that time, I switched career to climate. And in 2004, I wrote a book called The Weather Makers that was pretty popular globally. In 2007, I became Australian of the Year, and then I was Australia's first climate commissioner. I ran the Copenhagen Climate Council for the UNFCCC. So I've had a pretty long history now in climate change. And about 8 years ago, I set up a not-for-profit in Australia called the Climate Council, and that's where I still am. We give high-quality information about climate change to Australians so they can make the decisions that are required.
Yeah, so obviously your main context is Australian policy and so forth, but obviously I have an international audience on this show, but I'm also an American, and this is one of those issues that affects the whole world to varying extents. And I guess this is a good place to start is the pledges that have been made just a few months ago, I think, in Glasgow. Can you talk about what the hopes were for this latest meeting and what the result was?
Sure. Well, look, the Glasgow meeting actually only finished about a week ago, and I was there through the whole meeting. And it was interesting. I went in a little bit doubtful about how much progress had been made, but at the end of the meeting, it turned out we got a really good outcome. There was a series of side agreements that were really important. One dealt with coal. About 40 countries signed on to an agreement to phase out coal. There was another one about methane, which is a very important greenhouse gas that acts in the short term. And then there was an agreement to protect forests. And so all of those were good. In the meeting itself, we saw some really interesting things happen. India signed on for a net zero target for 2070, so it's quite a way out, but it's the first time they've ever done it. And if you add up all of the pledges that were made at that meeting, it looks like if they're honoured, we could cap warming at about 1.8 degrees above the pre-industrial average. So that's the first time it's been below 2 degrees. So we've had quite a lot of progress made at the Glasgow meeting. Not enough, but quite a lot. So I was pleased with the outcome.
So I always struggle with how to think of these verbal pledges that don't really have teeth, because, on the one hand, if America or China or India or any of these huge nations pledge to cut something and then don't do it, nothing happens. But on the other hand, based on the Glasgow meeting, people were really fighting over the specific language, right? There was China and India asked for a phasing out of coal to be changed to a phasing down of coal, which suggests that the specific phrasing and the pledges made do hold some sway. So how do you think about these pledges that are made without real teeth?
Look, every agreement that's ever made starts with words, and that's just the nature of any political agreement. If there's an agreement between you and me, Coleman, we might have a contract and we end up, if anything goes wrong, we could go to court, but that's a long and tedious process nobody really wants to get involved with. So, the way I see this is that people set their own targets, they pledge to meet those targets, and if they don't meet them, it's sort of it's bad news for them and the people they represent, because they can't even keep to their own targets. Nobody's imposed these targets on them. This is something they've said they're going to do, So for them then to fail to meet that target, it doesn't play well politically, and nor does it play well internationally. And, the world is moving ever closer to dealing with this problem in a holistic manner. So there's trade deals that are being brokered at the same time. There's various other agreements that are being brokered. And if you fail on a target you've set yourself personally, then you obviously lose credibility when it comes to all of these other deals. So I think that just making the pledges is really important, and it actually liberates people to act. I mean, so in the US, you've got a target, I think it's a 50% reduction by 2030, I believe it is. I have to check that. But, everyone involved in the US now, all the energy companies, all the businesses and others have got a target they can work to meet. And that is hugely important.
Yeah. So this other constant problem with the world's effort to combat climate change is that certain countries totally industrialized before this issue was really on all of our radars, whereas other countries began industrializing right around the time, and therefore began becoming wealthy and escaping poverty right around the time that we were realizing that, we're making the entire earth hotter by doing so. And so what do you make of the problem that a country like India faces, where we're sort of asking them to stunt their development in a way that we in America and Europe and Australia didn't have to?
Look, I don't think we're asking them to stunt their development, because clean energy now is much cheaper than fossil fuels. Mm. And so they have a development pathway available, which is a cost-effective one, that means developing clean technologies. Now, there will be some costs for India, and there's definitely a social justice issue. So, already we're seeing some impacts on India through, extreme heat waves, floods, melting glaciers, all these sort of things. And that has all come about as a result of emissions released many years ago. So there is a need for some sort of compensation or some sort of recognition of this by developed countries to help the developing countries to cope with the consequences of climate change. And the negotiations include this loss and damage concept that deals with that. So that's sort of outside the development pathway. I'm not so worried about the development pathway. It's there for everyone to do. I think part of loss and damage might be, offering some low-cost funding to allow that development to accelerate. But those things are being worked out through this COP process.
So your book is called The Climate Cure. What is the cure?
Well, the cure is very much what we did with COVID. The same. When you're faced with an emergency, you've got to do three things. You've got to stop the threat getting any worse, don't you? Or the emergency getting any deeper. That's the first thing. Then you've got to deal with the damage the emergency's already caused, and we have to do that. And third, if it's a medical emergency like COVID, you need to develop a vaccine. You need to develop a means of actually getting rid of that problem altogether. So when it comes to climate change, those are the three steps we need to take. The first one, make sure the problem doesn't get any worse, just means cutting emissions year after year, so moving to clean energy. So it's a big part of making sure the problem doesn't get worse. The second thing is the emergency room. Have we got a big enough emergency room to deal with all of the consequences of climate change? So we have to make sure that our medical systems are up to treating everyone who's harmed by heat waves and so forth. We have to make sure our firefighting services can fight the fires these mega fires we're seeing now. We have to make sure that our flood mitigation programs are all up to date and ready to deal with this much more intense climate we're dealing with. And, that's a big package there just by itself. I mean, you think that, all of the pipes in New York were built to deal with flooding from a previous climate, a much less intense climate. So those pipes will become overwhelmed unless they're replaced with larger diameter pipes. That's just one small illustration of sort of, adapting to what's already happened. So the emergency room is big. It also has to include protecting biodiversity, protecting our forests, protecting our coral reefs, and doing what we can to make sure that species don't go extinct as a result of the changing climate. So that middle bit is a very big bit for government to deal with. The third aspect is developing a vaccine, and we can develop a vaccine for climate change in a sense because the climate that we evolved in, the climate that we experienced until recent decades, was actually the result of the Earth system. I mean, the world's forests and the world's oceans, by drawing down CO2, helped create that climate. So if we can restore the Earth's forests, restore the function of the oceans, we'll have a very powerful tool to restabilise our climate and to make sure that we don't see a further deterioration of the conditions that we all live in.
Yes. So I told you before we started recording, and I'll remind listeners now, many months ago, I had Michael Schellenberger on, who's a critic of the mainstream consensus on climate policy among scientists. And he made a mix of interesting points and claims I found misleading. And this is part of the reason I'm having you on, is to sort of relitigate some of those claims, both the interesting ones and the ones I found to be misleading. So we'll start with the one that was interesting to me, was the idea that it's a myth that we're in the sixth mass extinction. This is something I've heard many people say, and this relates to your expertise of biodiversity, if I understand. So is there an agreed upon definition for a mass extinction is one question. Are we hitting it? And then third, just what is the impact? Regardless of that question, what is the impact of climate change on our biodiversity right now?
Sure, yeah. Well, look, Coleman, there is a biodiversity crisis. That's absolutely certain. Some people argue there's a sixth extinction event. And what they mean by that is that this extinction event that we're seeing on Earth is as large as the extinction events that have characterised the past, such as the extinction of the dinosaurs and that sort of thing. Now, we've got some very, very good figures on some aspects of biodiversity loss. So we know, for example, that the number of large predators like lions and elephants, the large herbivores like elephants and rhinos and so forth, they're pretty much in free fall. There is. I don't have the figures to hand, Coleman, but I'd be guessing that we've got a tenth as many lions at most that we had a century ago. And same for tigers and so forth. So those species are getting down to very, very low numbers. On top of that, we've seen quite a large number of extinctions in recent decades. Now, when we come to an extinction event and saying what caused it, it's very hard sometimes to discern exactly what the cause is. But there are already some climate impacts. So, for example, the most recent mammal to become extinct in Australia is a small rodent that lived on an island on the Great Barrier Reef that became extinct pretty clearly as a result of climate change. Rising sea levels, changing rainfall patterns meant that the freshwater swamps that it was dependent upon were replaced with salt water. And so that species became extinct as a result. And it was really common as little as 20 years ago. It's now extinct. So, there are other species that have become extinct as a result of hunting, such as, some of the rhinoceroses and so forth. There are others that have become extinct as a result of, catastrophic habitat loss. So, there's a fair bit of argument as to about what role climate is playing in that whole mix. You could say, is it 10%? Is it 90%? That's up for debate. But I think the fact is biodiversity is declining. We are entering a phase of pretty significant extinction, and climate change is playing some role in that.
So let's move on then to the claim that I found to be pretty misleading, which is that climate change is not making natural disasters worse.
That is really misleading, Coleman. That is absolutely misleading.
Yeah, let me just tee it up for you in the way that I found that to be very misleading as well. But his justification is that deaths from natural disasters have gone down in the past 100 years or so. So I give you that as, and just make of that what you will.
Sure. Well, look, deaths are the ultimate negative outcome of natural disasters, and there are many factors that relate to the number of deaths we see, including human preparedness to deal with this. But in terms of the disasters getting worse, we can see that is absolutely clearly happening. And one measure of that is the increase in rainfall intensity that we're seeing globally. This is one of the most well-attested effects of climate change, and it's occurring because as the atmosphere warms, it holds more water vapour, it becomes more dynamic, and therefore rainfall is coming in more intense bursts. And particularly where you are, Coleman, the northeastern US is one area where the signal's very clear. Where there used to be decades ago longer, more gentle periods of rainfall, there tends to be more downpours now, more intense downpours, and they tend to lead to flooding. So that is one example where you look at loss and damage, and you can see very clearly that that change in rainfall patterns is having an impact. Secondly, sea level rise. We know that sea level rise unequivocally is caused by climate change, and we're seeing impacts of sea level rise all around the world now. In my home country of Australia, there's some pretty astonishing examples. The Pacific Islands are even worse, where I work. In fact, I've got a friend who recently had to collect the bones of her grandmother and great-grandmother. They've been washed out of a cemetery that had been stable for many, many years, and the rising seas had eroded the graves away. So there's lots of evidence for rising sea level rise as well. Melting glaciers are causing more disasters, particularly in the Himalayan region and in the Arctic. We're seeing not just glaciers, but the permafrost melting, which is causing problems for communities as well. And, places like the Eastern Amazon, where we're seeing a drying trend that are leading to really severe droughts. And that's not to mention the mega fires that we're now seeing. I don't know what the American read is on this, but, we know that in Australia, we are seeing fires of unprecedented scale and ferocity. Just to give you an example, our last, the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020 burnt 21% of Australia's temperate broadleaf forests. The largest loss of those forests due to a fire prior to that was just 2%. So I've seen a 10% increase in one single fire season. That's unprecedented. And, we know why it's happening. It's the drying trend, it's the increased heat, and that is just leading to these mega fires.
Yeah, I know in the American case, we really think of fires just in California and maybe the Pacific Northwest. But what Schellenberger says about this, at least in the case of California, is that basically this is not the result of climate change, or at the very least, it's less the result of climate change than of forest mismanagement, of the policy of not doing controlled burns often enough and letting the wood fuel accumulate so that these massive fires happen. And if anything, that's a much bigger cause of the Californian wildfires than climate change. And even here, even if that's true, I think it's very misleading to say that climate change is not making it worse, because that's exactly the phrase he tends to use here, because what people take away is just climate change is not affecting the issue at all, rather than this much more nuanced claim at the end of it. But
yeah, look, Coleman, I'm not an expert on the Californian fires, so I hesitate to give you a view on it. But, what I've seen is that they're scrub fires by and large. Those houses, those communities that are being destroyed, at least in the southern part of California, they're not really in forests, they're in scrub, And I know, if I can just revert to Australia to explain what's happening, those fires that we saw, those massive fires, occurred after the 2 driest years ever recorded in southeastern Australia. And we had a hot, windy summer on top of that dryness, and the the fuel was ready to burn, Coleman. It was, there was, in the Australian case, absolutely nobody is disputing that it's related to climate change. I mean, the modelling that we've done shows that we could expect those conditions that led to the fire under natural circumstances maybe once every 400 years. But when you add the impact of climate change, we can expect them more than once a decade in the current era. So, there's absolutely no doubt that these mega fires, at least in Australia and probably elsewhere, have been really caused by climate change.
Yeah, and this is one aspect that's interesting about the worries about how bad things could get is when we summarize what can happen to the world in a number like 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. What that doesn't capture is all of the other ways in which a changing climate, can harm places, like too much rainfall, too little rainfall, and then also the diversity. The fact that the pain is born sort of in concentrated places and not in others. And so for one place for the temperature to rise, 3 degrees Celsius in one place and 1 degree somewhere else might be worse than if it rose 2 degrees everywhere, because the sort of compounding effects of these changes.
Well, that's right, Coleman. And could I just say that if we look at just think about where we are with climate change. 2 decades ago, it was pretty hard to find really significant impacts of climate change. There were small things happening, but scientists were saying, by and large, the worst in the future. So now we've seen some of those worst impacts. But 20 years from now, it's going to be worse again, because the greenhouse gases take about 20 to 30 years to reach their full warming potential. So no matter what we do, it's going to be worse 20 years from now. 40, 50 years from now, if we keep going the way we are, who knows what the situation's going to be like. We could be into absolutely catastrophic climate change. And as a geologist, that really worries me, because I've seen evidence in the geological record of just how severe this problem can become. I don't want to scare people with this, and I don't talk about it a lot, but there is a small chance that we'll see something like the end Permian conditions, where, the ocean currents slow down, the oceans lose oxygen, and then you get these sulfur bacteria that build up, and they can change things dramatically. They create a really toxic environment. We know it's happened in the past. I think the chances are small it'll happen in the future, but I certainly don't want to take that chance. The consequences are just too extreme.
So I think it's clear eventually, and sooner rather than later, we need to completely get off coal. The world needs to just completely replace coal with clean energy sources. And I think the cleanest we have, and that are also quite cheap, are wind, solar, and nuclear. And so I'm curious. I think there's some discussion of wind and solar in your book for sure, but almost none of nuclear. Was that a deliberate omission, or do you have a preference between those three sources, or what do you make of that?
Sure. Well, look, wind and solar are already very cheap globally, and for I think about 70% of the planet, they're the cheapest way of generating electricity now. And within a few years, it'll be true for the whole planet. Nuclear it's sort of, in Australia, it doesn't really work. We've got to have very large scale nuclear plants to be cost effective, at least today. So, dealing with 2,000 megawatt plants. And in Australia, we've only got 25 million people, so that would have to be strategically placed. They also use a lot of water, and Australia is very dry. So there's a number of reasons why nuclear isn't a really good fit for Australia. It's sort of a better fit for somewhere like China, where you've got very high demand and very high population density, and where the government will assume the entire risk of running the things. So really, it didn't even get to the start of the race in Australia. It hasn't been it's just never been a real option for us, which is why it wasn't in my book, because my book was mostly about Australia. But I can talk about nuclear if you want.
Yeah, I am. I'm interested in it for a few reasons. One is because there's this interesting economic fact that there are huge fixed costs for building a nuclear plant. And I'm curious if you agree with this, but what I've heard economists and other experts say is that it's more expensive than wind and solar in the short run because of the massive cost of building a plant. But if you zoom out to 100 years, 200 years, it's cheaper. Is that right?
Look, it could be, but a nuclear plant's only going to run 40 years or so. You've got to build a new one then. The best place to understand this, Coleman, is France, which in the 60s and 70s undertook a massive nuclear building program. And I remember going to France a decade or so ago and realising there was no energy efficiency stuff going on. And, that's for a good reason, because nuclear never stops producing. It's just high level. So the electricity's there, you might as well use it. You don't need to worry about energy efficiency. But what's happened in France is they're madly building wind and solar now, because a lot of those nuclear plants are coming to the end of their life, and they're all coming to the end of their life at once. So they've realised they need a more diverse mix to make the energy system really work. And for them, the absolute cheapest options are wind and solar. So they're retiring some of the old nuclear and building more wind and solar. So, look, I think there's a role for nuclear. It's probably going to be quite a small, niche role. The nuclear has been declining as part of the energy mix for decades now globally. I think that really, if you take the big picture and say where's the future going to be, it's all going to be wind and solar, because that'll be the cheapest. And once we start on the hydrogen economy and start building electrolyzers at scale, really that the wind and solar is going to challenge almost everything, because with hydrogen, you've got a fuel you can move around and use for a whole lot of purposes.
Yeah, so you have a section of the book devoted to the next generation of airplanes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, look, air travel is going to be the toughest nut to crack in terms of getting down to carbon neutrality. People are building electric aeroplanes right now. They're small ones, because you can't have a battery driving a 737 or a Dreamliner or anything like that. It just doesn't work. The scale isn't there. People are now building hydrogen aircraft. They're starting to, and in fact, one of them that was built recently, I think in the US, crashed sadly, but hydrogen is being used as a fuel. The trouble is it's not a very dense fuel, so there's difficulties there. The best option seems to be it's a kind of a high-density biofuel, or an e-fuel. That's a fuel that's made from hydrogen, made through wind and solar. So you generate electricity using wind and solar. You put it through a water bath. You generate hydrogen through electrolysis, and then you use that hydrogen through a process to create the equivalent of crude oil. But it's very, very pure. It doesn't have any of the contaminants like sulfur in it. It's a great jet fuel, but it's expensive at the moment. I should just remind your listeners, Coleman, that during the Second World War, the Luftwaffe flew on butanol made from potatoes. So we know we can make biofuels with a high density in a way that can run an aircraft. The problem is cost. And as any of these solutions like e-fuels scale up, they get cheaper. So I think in the long term, e-fuels are where we're going to be with aircraft, with jet travel. And I should just mention as well that that e-fuel initiative through carbon engineering came out of Harvard and is now being developed in British Columbia. So it's a North American initiative.
So I guess I also have a question about geothermal, which was really brought to my attention by Jamie Beard, who was a speaker at the latest round of TED Talks, who has this really strange and exciting idea of turning oil drilling operations into geothermal plants, which send a liquid down into the earth and leverage the geothermal energy, and then repurposing the people who work in oil drilling for that purpose as coal is phased out or as oil drilling is phased out. So what do you make of the possibility of geothermal energy?
I was a big backer of geothermal 15 years ago, and we lost that bet in Australia. And the reason why geothermal just became too expensive in Australia is that every well you drill has a different geological context, slightly different, and you don't really learn a lot in terms of economies of scale if you drill maybe 100 wells. But if you make 1 billion solar panels or 10 billion solar panels and make 1 million wind turbines, you sure as hell learn a lot about shortcuts in manufacturing and just efficiency in manufacturing. And that's why wind and solar have got so cheap, because we're making them by the millions and billions, the individual units. And as you do that, they just get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. That's the nature of mass production. And it's really hard for me to imagine any of those other technologies that don't have that asset of mass production ever catching up with wind and solar. They just seem to have won the race hands down. Coleman, it's really, they're so far ahead now, it's hard for me to imagine any other technology catching up in terms of price.
So I guess there's also electric vehicles to talk about. I mean, Tesla's just having a massive boom right now in America, and I don't know if that's the same in Australia. But can you talk a little bit about electric vehicles and the role they're going to play?
Sure. Well, we will eventually electrify everything. There's no doubt about that. And for for motor cars, the sort of stuff we all drive as individuals, electrification is going to be the future. I mean, the Japanese are still making some hydrogen fuel cars, but I don't think they're going to be competitive. That technology is just so far ahead. And again, mass production is what's going to assist the manufacture of batteries and cars. As you mass produce, everything gets cheaper. So Tesla are still relatively expensive, but there's some major manufacturers in China which have got a scalability that's kind of unbelievable, really, on their side, that I think are going to push electric vehicles globally in a big way. My suspicion is that the petrol fueled cars, I drive a hybrid, but the one I drive now is the last petrol driven car I'm ever going to buy, and that's true for most of my friends too. We're right on the brink of that change, and electric vehicles are just so superior in so many ways, from cost to the fact you can fuel them at home using your solar panels, at least in Australia. I think they're going to be, they're going to be unstoppable. But it's a different issue, Coleman, when it comes to heavy vehicles, heavy transport, like trucks and so forth. We might see more hydrogen used there.
Yeah. So I realize I have another question about the sort of Jamie Beard's idea. In America, we've had this problem of the past, I say, 20 years of factories closing down and leaving whole towns that built their culture around a factory sort of never the same, hollowed out, where the economic rationale for outsourcing that job makes perfect sense. It's cheaper to get it done in China or India, and there's just no economic reason. It's just economics 101 to outsource in that way, but it has this consequence that's disproportionately borne by certain people, and this is linked to our mental health crisis and our opioid crisis, where people don't just necessarily move and find new work when they're put out of work. And so I'm curious, and this is not exactly your expertise, but I'm curious if you think about this, what's going to happen to rank and file employees of the coal industry and all of these industries that we need to sort of end or phase out.
Yeah. Look, it's something I think about a lot, Coleman. We've got the same issue in Australia of regions which are very heavily dependent upon coal. In Australia, we're looking at overseas initiatives in this area. So one very interesting one is called the German Coal Compromise, where the German government has got together with the coal industry and all of its employers and local government to guarantee that not one single job will be lost as a result of the transition. They're going to close all their coal, but there's a lot of work to be done in remediating coal mines. There's a lot of new industries that can be built, such as pumped up hydro in old coal mines, tourism, and so forth. So they've taken a particular approach where the federal government or the German government's pouring money into that. In Australia, we've just done the calculation of what it would cost to give every one of our coal workers a salary for life, regardless of whether they're digging up coal or not. And the costs are small compared with lots of other transition costs. So I think that we'll see, at least in Australia and Europe, a move towards this just transition where we take care of those communities, give them opportunities, really have deep discussions with them about what they want in terms of their future, and then finance that transition. So this is something that is it's kind of a very top of mind issue at the moment for people in Europe and in Australia, and I'm confident we can find ways through that. It's just part of a good democracy to take care of everyone, and that needs to happen as the economy changes.
It's interesting. Translating that to an American context, I struggle to see the federal administration that makes something like that work federally. Just because, like on the left, it's coal miners are not particularly popular or sympathetic victims. And on the right, welfare is not particularly popular or sympathetic policy. So it's that might have to happen at the state level if it happened at all. But it does seem like something like that is needed. Yeah,
but why would you see it as welfare? It's welfare for the whole of the society, isn't it? To make sure that people don't get disadvantaged and addicted to drugs. You'll pick up the bill anyway, Coleman, whether it's in the hospitals or, or in the crime or whatever. We might as well just get on the front foot and treat people justly and fairly and openly as we go forward with this.
Yeah. So another topic I think you touch in the book is whether eating less meat or becoming vegetarian or vegan should be a focus of the environmental movement. This is definitely a hot topic for many people. I've been a vegetarian before, but I'm not anymore. So what do you make of becoming a vegetarian for this reason?
Well, if you look at the figures, something like 20% in very round figures of the greenhouse gas emissions come from what's called AFLOU, agriculture, forestry and other land use. 80% come from the burning of fossil fuels. So when you're talking about meat, it's part of that 20 to 25% AFLOU. So that's important. It's still a quarter of emissions. And, doing what you can to avoid emissions is great. I just point out that some meat is much more emissions intensive than others. So beef is quite emissions intensive, but chickens aren't, neither's pork. So, and some vegetable products are very emissions intensive. If you're, eating soybeans or any crops that are grown on land that's where rainforest has been cleared, that's pretty emissions intensive. And even corn growing, where you're losing carbon from the soil in places like the US, is emissions intensive. So my view of it is, we're best to try to have a low emissions diet overall. So take into account all the food you eat. And to the best you can, educate yourself about where the emissions come from and try to limit them. So, I'm not a vegetarian, but I do eat much less meat than I did, say, a decade or so ago. And I try to eat meat that's from the less emissions intensive aspects of the meat production system.
Yes. Is there something like a low carbon footprint diet that anyone has? Because I don't really see people emphasizing the soybean and corn.
No.
As
look, there are people, and there's a whole sustainable and regenerative agriculture sector out there where people are working, small holdings, growing things without chemicals and herbicides and pesticides, which is better for the soil and gives you better soil carbon retention. So there are moves in that direction, but I think it'll be a while before we're getting the bulk of our food from those more sustainable practices.
Yeah, I guess this also highlights an issue, which is whether the climate cure is going to come from sort of one by one from the bottom up, just efforts, changing our lifestyles and so forth. Basically, making sacrifices or lifestyle changes on the individual level, or governments getting their shit together, basically.
Yeah, look, it's a great point. And, the fossil fuel industry would love you to think that it was all about what you do, and there's an element to that. Of course, we all have to live our lives as sustainably as we can if we want to deal with the problem. But ultimately, it's the regulatory framework that's really important, the role that government plays, the role that financing plays, the way carbon is accounted in industries, all of that is critically important. So while I think we should all do what we can to limit our carbon intake. We should see that as an act of climate leadership and urge our governments on to acts of climate leadership, because that's what it's all about in the end. We need to move together as a society. Government's an integral part of that. Business is a big part of it. So we've got to change the whole system, and we can't do that just by changing what we eat, for example, or what we as individuals drive, you know.
So I guess my last question here is, to what extent is there a legitimate trade-off between fighting climate change and just, you know, advancing our economy? Is there is there anywhere where you really worry that it's possible to go too far with our efforts to fight climate change and end up stunting our economy as a result? Or do you think that this is just kind of a false choice?
It's definitely a false choice. I mean, you know, when you see you can study economies today that have reduced emissions pretty dramatically and have a look at the impact on the economy. You know, basically it's zero. The economy's doing better in those places. You know, just think about the world you're creating. So you're creating a world where we're not dependent upon imports of oil from, you know, the Middle East or whatever. That's saving money. You've got cleaner, more efficient processes. Again, that's saving money. All of the consequences of dirty processes like poor health and greater hospitalisation rates and these sort of things, they all disappear. So you're saving money there, you know. So I think there's absolutely no doubt you're creating a better, more efficient, more prosperous world as you move forward. The big thing is you've got to take care of the people who are already engaged in those old dirty industries and who might be, for whatever reason, unable to retrain or move on. So that's the challenge, but that's the role of government. That's what government should be doing, is looking after the people, looking after their electors. So you know, I think that you know, we don't need fear that we have to give anything up as we move to that cleaner, better world.
All right. Well, on that note, this has been a great conversation. Let me just plug your book one more time. There's a lot there that we didn't cover. It's called The Climate Cure: Solving the Climate Emergency in the Era of COVID-19. So I urge you all to go pick that up. And thank you so much, Tim, for your time. Hope to have you back at some point.
Thanks, Coleman. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, that note of optimism is really important, I think, for all of your listeners. Just know that we can do this and we'll end up better off. Thank you.